I'm Joanna Baker, and along with Sam Owens, we are very thrilled to present our speaker, Tammy Hong. Tammy earned her BA in Art History, Studio Art and History from Syracuse University. As an art historian and aspiring conservator, her work is driven by her interest in exploring how the complexities behind individual and collective memories and the acts of remembering and forgetting relate to the ways we examine material and immaterial cultural heritage. She is currently the Andrew W. Mellon Artist Materials Intern in Conservation at the National Gallery of Art and is serving on the intern coordination team for WCG. In her position at the NGA, Tammy is able to combine her research interests in artist materials and art history through cataloging artist materials and associating important items in the Art Materials Research and Study Center with their manufacturing history and art historical context. Her presentation today on Chinese ink sticks in 19th century Britain explores the intersections between Chinese and European ink traditions through the lenses of artist materials, manufacturing, pigments, and their materialities, and globalization. I'd like to welcome Tammy. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Joanna. Let me just share my screen. Thank you, Joanna, again for that introduction. As Joanna mentioned, I am also on the intern coordination team for WCG along with McGill, Morgan, and Karen. Before we begin, I want to make an announcement regarding our upcoming interns virtual event. The event will be on November 18th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. We're actually going to open the Zoom room a little bit earlier at 5:45. So if you want to come and chat with us, you're welcome to. This event is going to be a conservation career day panel. So if you're pre-program or even if you're a conservation fellow or you're committed to pursuing conservation as a career or you're just interested in the field but you don't know where to start, this is a great event to attend to get more information. This event is free, but you do have to RSVP, and the RSVP link is posted on the Washington Conservation Guild website, or you can email us at interns@washingtonconservationguild.org for more information, and that way we can also add you to our mailing list so you can stay updated on our virtual event. Okay, now back to today's talk. Hello everyone, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to WCG for inviting me to present today. Again, I'm Tammy Hong, and I'm the Artist Materials Intern in Conservation at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington. My position at the gallery has given me the unique opportunity to explore the intersection between conservation science, materials manufacturing, and art history through cataloging and researching artist materials housed in the Art Materials Research and Study Center. So the items in this collection, from tubes of paint to manufacturing literature, are all primary sources that allow researchers to further explore the ways in which historical and economic factors were interwoven with artist materials and practices. Here on the screen, I just pulled a few images from our database. So we have paint samples here on your bottom left, and we mostly collect modern materials, meaning these artist materials date to 70s onwards. And an example of that would be the Golden Core watercolors that people still use today. We also have a collection of vintage materials, and an example of that would be the Winsor & Newton Raffaelle's oil stick that dates around the 19th century. In addition to these materials, we also have a lot of manufacturing literature from suppliers that are working domestically in the United States and also international ones. This collection is a great resource for conservators, art historians, and scientists who are interested in materials research. So hopefully everyone here will get a chance to come visit us whenever this COVID situation is over and we are allowed more visitors at the museum. My interest in ink and art materials really developed during my internship. This project, titled Indian Ink, Chinese Ink Sticks, More, Reinterpreted in 19th Century Britain, is still a bit of a work in progress, and I would love to hear your thoughts or suggestions, and also I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of this presentation. Well, I was cataloging items in the collection. I came across this 19th century presentation box from the well-known British artist supplier, Charles Roberson & Co. This Roberson box includes 10 color cakes embossed with the Roberson emblem, 6 brushes, a ceramic china tile, and a Chinese ink stick from the ink studio of Wang Jingshen, who is one of the main Qing Dynasty ink studios in China. Here is a scan of a Qing Dynasty Wang Jingshen catalog that shows you the same design that we have here on the ink stick that was in the Roberson box. The 3 characters read Qing Yun Lu, and you can actually see that here in the catalogs. The combination of artist materials in the box represents a fusion of Chinese and British art practices, 2 very distinct aesthetics traditions. Opening the Roberson box when I was cataloging was like opening, it was almost like opening a meticulously curated box of fancy chocolates. Everything was in its compartment, and you have this description here indicating how you should mix the colors, what each color was made of. But interestingly, it actually didn't mention how you should be using the Chinese ink stick, which I will talk a little bit more about later. Also considering when the materials of the box date to the box was in pristine condition. All of these materials, like I mentioned, fit into their designated compartments in the box, indicating that they were meant to be used together in some way. Now, for more context, I reached out to the Yale Center for British Art, who also had 2 very similar Roberson boxes in their collection. The components in the Yale boxes were very similar to those in the National Gallery's box. So here is one of the boxes from Yale, and again, it's like a very beautifully curated box of chocolates. You have very beautiful Roberson embossed Roberson embossed watercolor cakes. You also have brushes, a china tile at the bottom compartment, and the ink stick is actually here. And this is another Roberson box from the Yale collection. And in this box, there's actually a slot reserved for the ink stick, and instead of brushes, it has a pen nib and also a china tile. These Yale boxes further confirm that Charles Roberson indeed intended to include Chinese ink sticks in these presentation boxes. These Roberson boxes were made by Charles Roberson & Co. for the Department of Science and Art, a British government-sanctioned body that aimed to promote education in art, science, technology, and design in Britain and Ireland from 1853 to 1899. The department awarded these boxes to students who attended various British government schools in the 19th century. Produced in notable numbers, many of the surviving Roberson boxes have a long, narrow slot at one end of the box that was reserved for an ink stick that can sometimes be found intact. It is to this artifact, the National Gallery of Art's Roberson box, a collection of the fundamental artist materials in 19th century Britain, that this presentation turns. How are Chinese ink sticks, mo in Mandarin, a medium so indispensable in Chinese visual and literary culture, incorporated into the standard art practices of 19th century Britain? A 19th century Roberson catalog revealed that Chinese ink sticks were labeled as Indian ink. Other well-known British artist suppliers based in London, known as colormen in the 19th century, also advertised Chinese ink sticks, solid carbon black pigment sticks from China, as India ink or Indian ink. Used to this day for drawing, writing, and outlining in Western art, Indian ink is more familiar to us and understood to be this, a highly opaque carbon black liquid medium. Though modern liquid Indian ink often contains other additives like shellac, its basic material composition and namesake were derived from the liquid Indian ink introduced by Winsor and Newton in the 1890s that appeared alongside Chinese ink sticks that were also labeled as Indian ink in the supplier's 19th century catalogs. In 19th century British colorman catalogs, liquid Indian ink was described as a liquid drawing medium made from the genuine stick ink imported directly from China. The information provided in these catalogs identified that liquid Indian ink was manufactured by British colormen in the 19th century as drawing ink prepared from Chinese ink sticks imported into Europe through the China trade. In China, Chinese ink sticks were first described in a 10th century treatise on writing materials, titled Collective Studies of 4 Articles for Writing in a Scholar's Studio, 文房四谱, from the Song Dynasty. Modern understanding of Chinese ink sticks in China is heavily dependent on monographs and treatises on ink and ink making from the Song Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. Scholarship on Chinese ink sticks in the West began in the early 1800s. These sources were mostly written in German and French before quickly expanding to other languages in Europe. In addition to the dense corpus of writing about British watercolor and drawing practices, Western interest in the materialities of Chinese ink sticks has continued to the present day, with the most recent publications in English by John Winter, his book titled East Asian Paintings. He has also published articles on carbon black related electron micrography, and also Jennifer Jakai, who is the conservation scientist at the National Museum of Asian Art, who is pushing Raman analysis of carbon black particles in Chinese ink sticks for her current research. Now, looking at this timeline, the National Gallery of Art's Roberson box and those from Yale, all dating to the 19th century, direct our attention to the moment in this historical time frame where not only does the Chinese and European scholarship on Chinese ink sticks overlapped, but it is also where the uses of Chinese ink sticks and both aesthetics traditions intersected. Now, despite the main focus of this presentation being the impact of Chinese ink sticks on 19th century British art practices, we must keep in mind that Chinese ink sticks were also used in writing at the same time. Institutions, governing bodies, and companies that defined British artistic, economic, and social trends in the 19th century, like the Department of Science and Art, British Colormen, and the British East India Company, had meticulous record-keeping practices. In the words of the renowned human geographer Miles Ogborn, these records of communication in the form of writing are central to understanding the relationships between knowledge, power, and social change. Thus, Indian ink, prepared Chinese ink sticks, was used to document formulas of production, to catalog the transactions of commodities, and to record the interactions between people at the height of the British Empire. Here on the screen are just some examples of the documents from the British East India Company, just to show you visually how neat and organized record keeping was. They documented topics such as accounts and transactions, and also more specific topics like just the exchange of vegetable products. There were volumes and volumes of the transactions regarding vegetables. Indian ink was pertinent to the materialization of a selective British imperial memory by granting the wielders of the quill pen the power to establish and reinforce British dominance, particularly in India during the 19th century. Here it is important to recognize that Indian ink was not only a medium used in British art practices, but it was also a medium that was used to produce a wealth of tangible evidence that was crucial to British empire building. The National Gallery of Art's Roberson box is indisputable evidence of the 19th century negotiations regarding artist materials between China and Europe. The trade between artist materials within the context of 19th century globalization were understudied in comparison to other commodities of the China trade, like tea, porcelain, and silk. As a valuable primary source, the Roberson box allows us to examine the intersection between Chinese and European ink traditions which had long been overlooked. Drawing on the histories of the China trade and of carbon black pigments in China and Britain, this project examined how the Chinese ink stick was reinvented as Indian ink in 19th century Britain. Here, I'm particularly interested in tracing the cultural value of the Chinese ink stick from its origin in China to its reinterpretation as Indian ink. How are British artists introduced to Chinese ink sticks? What about the materialities of Chinese ink sticks contributed to its reinvention as Indian ink? How were Chinese ink sticks incorporated into British art practices and visual culture? These are the questions this presentation will aim to answer. This presentation will explore the place Chinese ink sticks, more occupied in the practices of British artists through analyzing the Robeson box and its contents in relation to the commodification and methodization of art making in 19th century Britain. Chinese ink sticks arrived in Britain by way of the British involvement in the China trade. The British Empire's control of 1/5 of the world's land by the 19th century encouraged globalization, trade, economic integration, and cultural exchange on an unprecedented level. But trade relations between Britain and China were governed by Chinese imperial dictates. At the beginning of the Qing dynasty, Emperor Kangxi officially allowed foreign merchants to trade with China in 1685. Shanghai, Binghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, Nantai, Aumen, Zhuhai, and Canton were the ports that permitted foreign access, but most merchants preferred to enter through Canton due to its proximity to Southeast Asia. In order to exert more control over foreign trade, Emperor Qianlong established the Canton system, 一口通商, that dated from 1757 to 1842, that confined all foreign trade to Canton, which is present-day Guangzhou. As a result, European merchants had a very limited access to China. Although it is difficult to pinpoint when Chinese ink sticks began traveling to Britain, archival sources of the China trade offered us clues to the patterns of exchange associated with the Chinese ink stick. Western supercargoes who participated in trade with China since the 18th century had a private trade allowance, which provided individual merchants the opportunity to earn money on a private basis without having to remit funds back to the country or company they worked for. In a letter written in 1756 by John Chambers, a British merchant, to his brother, the acclaimed architect Sir William Chambers, who famously designed the Chinese-inspired Great Pagoda at Kew, Chambers promised his brother that he would send him Chinese ink sticks via the lucrative private trade system. As the British East India Company expanded its maritime networks in the Indian Ocean, the colorman business flourished in Britain and in different parts of the British Empire, such as India. Products from abroad were implemented into the color experiments of well-known London-based colormen like Charles Roberson, George Rowney, Reeves and Sons, James Newman, and Winsor Newton in the 19th century. Even prior to the 18th century, imported materials were sold at the London docks by ships' chandlers and merchant importers at a location close to Reeves's first shop at 80 Holborn Bridge. Here is a map that I made of the 19th century addresses of the colormen that I just mentioned, just to put the accessibility of these materials to these colormen into perspective. The docks would be located somewhere near Point D, which is the address of Reeves and Sons' first shop. It would probably be stationed somewhere on the River Thames here. Chinese ink sticks served a very specific function, which meant that they were in significantly lower demand on the British market compared to other Chinese export goods like tea, porcelain, and silk. Chinese ink sticks were items easily included in private trade quotas. That said, only a small quantity of Chinese ink sticks would have been exported at a time. The First Opium War ended the Canton system and the Qing dynasty's control over foreign trade in China. 4 treaty ports, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, were open to foreign traders in addition to Canton, following the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. After China's defeat in the Second Opium War, The British acquired a number of concessions throughout China, securing British influence in key places like Shamian Island in Canton, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Under Empress Dowager Cixi's rule, foreign industrial powers in China were allowed almost full control over their concessions and were able to freely import and export goods. The National Gallery of Art's Roberson box, along with other color boxes that also contain Chinese ink sticks from the Art Materials Research and Studies Center and the Yale Center for British Art consulted for this project, all date to the mid to late 19th century. The concentration of Chinese ink sticks dating to the latter half of the century coincided with Britain's consolidation of power over their Chinese concessions. This suggests a correlation between the fortification of British influence in China and the increasing number of Chinese ink sticks being imported into Britain. Now, before we move on, I want to take some time to discuss the Chinese ink stick, its material composition, how complex it is as a cultural concept, and the ways in which this very concept of ink manifested itself in the 19th century British context as Indian ink. Manufactured in the form of a solid stick rather than as an aqueous solution, the Chinese ink stick is not to be confused with European notions of ink. Its solid stick form allowed for it to last for decades without drying out, and for preparing liquid ink from it as necessary. The carbon black particles in Chinese ink sticks required submersion in water while rubbing on an inkstone to be dispersed. Here is a video of me doing a demo, just to give you an idea of how it's prepared. And now the resulting solution from this process would be applied with a brush. The term ink corresponds to two distinct concepts of ink in China and Europe. The term for ink in Mandarin, mo, refers to the solid ink stick, whereas in the European context, ink refers to an aqueous solution, and that doesn't translate very well. To fully address the histories associated with ink in both its solid and liquid forms, mo shui and mo zhi, Mandarin terms that describe prepared ink, must be taken into account whenever researching these ink traditions. In this presentation, to avoid confusion, Chinese ink sticks will be used to address the solid state of ink unless stated otherwise. My investigation also revealed how the very fluidity of ink led to the reframing of the Chinese ink stick as Indian ink in 19th century Britain. Here, the role of Indian ink in writing must also be considered. Mentioned previously, the practice of record keeping was a key component to British colonial empire building. Considering its expansive reach and its economy's basis in global trade, the British Empire saw writing as a highly valued skill set in the 19th century. The use of Indian ink, a waterproof and versatile medium, by the British East India Company contributed to the establishment of the political structure of the British Empire in India. The British East India Company, that operated on trade in the Indian Ocean, relied on their system of scribes and clerks to maintain detailed records of correspondence and documents pertaining to company proceedings. Also in the British military, rapid sketching and documentation reconnaissance work were also highly desirable skills of soldiers stationed overseas, and I'll get a little bit more into this later. These records, including communication in Indian ink in various forms, such as letters, transactions, and maps, showcase that writing and drawing in 19th century Britain were interlinked in the practice of record keeping. Here are some of the documents from the East India Company that we saw earlier, and here's an example of a typographical drawing from the British military showing the relationship between documentation and drawing, seeing how the maps are very rigidly drawn, and also there are annotations on this documentation. Moreover, the act of documenting in Indian ink allowed for the British imperial identity and memory to crystallize in the form of tangible records. 19th century colormen, artists, and amateurs were all aware that Indian ink was imported from China as solid sticks, despite the way Chinese ink sticks in their solid physical states were marketed in colorman catalogs under a misnomer. Here's a quote from Field's Chromatography acknowledging the origin of Indian ink. George Field was the chemist at Winsor & Newton in the 19th century, and his research on this volume was widely distributed. The shortcomings in accommodating the concept of ink as a solid stick in the English language resulted in an inconsistent system in labeling the medium. Here on the screen, we have a variety of names and labels. We have Indian ink, India ink, best quality Chinese inks, best Nanking Indian ink. Some of the colorman catalogs dating to the second half of the 19th century labeled Chinese ink sticks as best Nanking Indian ink, a term that advertised the medium as a product familiar to British consumers while paying homage to its Chinese origin. Other colormen neglected to mention the origin of Chinese ink sticks and continued to sell the medium as Indian ink. When liquid Indian ink was introduced by Winsor & Newton in the 1890s, the aqueous medium used liquid to specify this medium's physical state and to distinguish the product from Chinese ink sticks that were also sold as Indian ink. Despite colormen being consistent with the British practice of meticulous record keeping, it is uncertain where the term Indian ink originated from. Interestingly, even written documentation that pertained to the larger British colonial historical framework do not provide accurate accounts of the origin of the term in Britain. In a general history of China, which is a French source, Chinese ink sticks were already referred to as Indian ink. Written by the French Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Duhalde and translated by the English physician Richard Brooks, this influential volume observed that the best Indian ink, Chinese ink sticks, came from the Chinese city of Nanking. These terms likely influenced the naming conventions of Chinese ink sticks in Britain. Furthermore, 19th century colorman catalogs visually differentiated Chinese ink sticks from liquid Indian ink, thereby contributing to the eventual separation of the narratives associated with these artist materials. The Roberson box is therefore entangled with the web of commercial, cultural, and artistic linkages between China and Britain, through which the Chinese ink stick, a beloved cultural object in China, evolved to become a medium interwoven with British art practices. Marketed by colormen in a way that reinvented it as Indian ink, the Chinese ink stick became part and parcel of British imperial history at a time when India had crystallized into Britain's most prized territorial acquisition. In a sense, the relabeling of the Chinese ink stick as Indian can be read as an orientalizing move, for Eastern goods, be they from China or India, were often regarded as Oriental commodities. Their identity is interchangeable, regardless of their place of origin. It might also be a means of claiming the ink stick as a British imperial product, rather than a Chinese one. In this context, the very act of relabeling the Chinese ink stick as an inherently Chinese cultural symbol as Indian ink by 19th century colormen was a means of exerting British imperial dominance. Following the increased interest in art making in Britain, the utilitarian and versatile characteristics of the Chinese ink stick played an integral part in defining Britain's domestic material civilization and visual culture in the 19th century. Composed of 90 to 99% carbon black particles, Chinese ink sticks are carbon black pigments. Other carbon black pigments include lamp black, ivory black, bone black, and vine black. Carbon black, Tanhei, by definition, is any pigment that contains some form of elemental carbon as its main or sole ingredient. Carbon black pigments are overall very stable and versatile. Moreover, they have high tinting strengths and are not easily affected by light or air. Their compatibility with all other pigments make carbon blacks highly desirable in an artist's practice. The composition of Chinese ink sticks includes carbon black particles, animal glue, and occasionally some additives. Though the sizes of ink sticks vary, the sticks will always be small enough to be held by hand. The tactile properties of the ink sticks were enhanced by the shapes and decorative elements used to embellish them. Distinct to different ink studios, these ornamental elements were formed from the shapes and engravings of the molds used to make the sticks. Here is just a selection of micrographs that I took of the Chinese ink sticks in the National Gallery's collection, just to give you a variety of all the different designs that we have. The carbon black clay mixture was forced into a decorative and structured mold made of either wood or copper when it is still warm in the ink making process. Designs were engraved into the molds beforehand, so the ornamentations will appear in relief on the sticks. So here on the stick from the Roberson box, there are some more detailed micrographs. You can actually see the designs appearing in relief. And if you look really closely, you can actually see some of the grain, the wood grain of the mold on the surface of the stick. Once the ink sticks have thoroughly dried, more decorative painted and gilded elements will be added by hand. So the blue of the characters and the gold of the chop would have been added after the stick has dried. In China, Chinese ink sticks are considered paint. In sharp contrast, in European art practice, the medium is classified as a watercolor due to its water solubility. Lampblack watercolor cakes are the most similar to Chinese ink sticks in terms of their sources of carbon black particles and their solid physical states. Lampblack is a smoke black obtained by burning resins or resinous woods. The carbon black particles used in some Chinese ink sticks were and still are acquired in a similar way. Despite the similarities between Chinese ink sticks and lampblack watercolor cakes, treatises and studies on color from 19th century Britain reveal that there were subtle differences in the ways Chinese ink sticks and lampblack color cakes behave as a medium. Indian ink was a medium with strong permanency and feeble power, whereas lampblack was a medium with light permanency and power. Such a technical reading of Indian ink reflected the maneuverability of the medium in comparison to that of lampblack despite their compositional similarities. Indian ink, the solution prepared from Chinese ink sticks, was used in a variety of different art practices in 19th century Britain. The solution was not only applied with the brush and watercolor drawings. In architectural drawings, the solid stick was also prepared on an Indian inkstone and applied with a steel pen. I did some testing with a quill pen with some Chinese ink I prepared just to give everyone an idea of what the application might have looked like. In printing, a thin wash of Indian ink was used to indicate light and shadow on a sketch printed on the wood block before carving. The thickness of an Indian ink solution could be adjusted to create washes with varying intensities. For instance, a thick solution of Indian ink was commonly applied with a quill pen to outline the ornamental elements and calligraphy in illuminated manuscripts. A study of modern carbon black watercolors demonstrate the superiority of Chinese ink sticks in terms of maneuverability and even particle dispersion. Paint samples of bone black, ivory black, vine black, and lamp black watercolors were prepared by diluting the mediums with a gum solution. The purpose of this study was to compare the saturation intensities and versatilities upon application of these carbon black watercolors to those of Chinese ink sticks. The Chinese ink solution was found to demonstrate a delicacy when transitioning from light to dark, unlike the saturated paint samples of the other pigments, despite their dilution. Furthermore, cracking can be observed with the naked eye on the surfaces of bone black, ivory black, and vine black. And the cracking is due to the uneven dispersion of the carbon black particles. And this was not observed on the surface of the Chinese ink sample. What guarantees the delicacy and even particle dispersion of prepared Chinese ink sticks upon application? The ingredients of Chinese ink sticks, though simple, were combined in a way to produce a medium of high quality. Carbon black particles were mixed with an aqueous solution of glue and other additives to form a clay-like mass. The mixture is then steamed, sprinkled with water, kneaded, rolled, and pounded before being pressed into the decorative molds. It is significant to note that manufacturing methods in Chinese sources, such as the Qiming Yao Shu, placed emphasis on the number of times 30,000 times, the ink clay must be pounded. The animal glue binder of Chinese ink sticks separates the medium from lamp black watercolor cakes and other carbon black pigments that commonly use plant-based gum arabic as their binders. Animal glue is important in maintaining the even particle dispersion of Chinese ink sticks when applied. Though the origin of animal glue varied throughout sources, 3 types of raw materials were commonly cited: skins of large animals, deer antler, and fish skins. The glue to carbon ratio is suggested to be either 1:1 or 1:4 by weight. Carbon black particles cannot adhere to the surfaces of paper on its own because these particles are hydrophobic. Thus, animal glue is required to facilitate the medium's even dispersion and adhesion to surfaces. Pounding the clay mixture not only ensures the thorough mixing of the components in ink making, but it also forces the animal glue onto the hydrophobic surfaces of carbon black particles. This step, heavily emphasized in Chinese sources on ink making, is pertinent in maintaining the even particle dispersion of Chinese ink sticks when the medium is applied. In the European understanding of carbon black pigments, lamp black is a flame carbon, meaning the source of the pigment's carbon is the burning or pyrolysis of gas or oil. Historically, these flame carbons were produced by burning oils, fats, resins, wood, or similar materials at a wick or in open pans. Seen along these lines, Chinese ink sticks that were made from soot collected in the same way would also be considered a flame carbon. However, in Chinese ink studies, it is important to further identify flame carbons by the source of their soot to fully understand the materialities of Chinese ink sticks. Soot ink, 油烟墨, is produced from carbon black particles obtained by burning oil at a wick, while pine soot ink, 松烟墨, is produced from carbon black particles obtained by burning pine wood. There are subtle differences in particle sizes and aggregations of the carbon black particles in Chinese ink sticks of different origins. The smaller the particle size of carbon black pigments, the higher the tinting strength. Chinese ink sticks have the smallest particles of any pigment other than organic colorants. Since soot ink sticks have finer carbon particles than that of pine soot ink, the color of soot ink is noticeably vibrant and saturated, making soot ink most suitable for calligraphy and for completing the foregrounds of Chinese paintings, whereas pine soot ink sticks produced in the mid-19th century were most suitable for the backgrounds of Chinese paintings to create an atmospheric perspective. Carbon black particles acquired from different sources required different carbon to animal glue ratios in the ink making process to accommodate their hydrophobic characteristics. Soot ink sticks have finer carbon particles than that of pine soot ink. There tends to be more animal glue in soot ink sticks, so the grinds, which is the top and the bottom of the stick, would have a sheen. The soot ink stick's interior would have an obvious reflective quality when compared to pine soot ink sticks produced in the Qing dynasty. Here are some of the micrographs I took of 2 ink sticks from color boxes in the materials collection at the National Gallery. One of them was already a half stick and the other one was already broken, so I was able to take a little peek inside. So from my observations, it seems like this stick, the interior has more of a oily sheen versus this one looks prettier. And I think this is the difference in the level of shine that likely separates an ink stick made from carbon obtained by burning oil and one from burning pine wood. But further scientific analysis and research are required to identify the sources of carbon black particles in Chinese ink sticks exported to Europe in the 19th century. The shortcomings in thoroughly understanding the materialities of Chinese ink sticks in 19th century Britain were reflected in the ink stick imitations manufactured by London colormen. 19th century colormen were highly skilled technicians of color and pigments who provided raw materials and prefabricated products for artists and amateurs. Despite so, imitations of Chinese ink sticks made by colormen were distinguished by their grittiness during preparation, their overpowering scent of musk, and the lack of delicacy and transparency during application. The ingredients used to make Chinese ink sticks were similar to other carbon black pigments known in London and could have been easily sourced locally. However, Chinese ink sticks were commercial items that depended solely on imports rather than domestic production. As a result, one can speculate that the unsuccessful British imitations of Chinese ink sticks owe their failures to the gaps in understanding the intricacies of the Chinese ink making process. Moreover, the lack of scholarship on the varieties of Chinese ink sticks imported into Britain is an indication of the ways in which the complexities of Chinese ink sticks as a Chinese cultural object were overlooked the moment they departed from China. The contents of the National Gallery of Art's Robeson box showcase the Chinese ink stick's relation to the evolving British attitudes toward art and society and culture in the 19th century. British maritime nationalism led to a patriotic interest in art domestically. Following the dominance of the British Empire and the British military overseas, the Chinese ink stick was observed further interwoven with the commodification and methodization of fine art and art making. In the 19th century, a variety of products was offered by British colormen for audiences from all levels of the social hierarchy to accommodate their consumers' desire to participate in their expression of British patriotism through art making. The importance of the Chinese ink stick in British visual culture was reinforced by the British arts education system, the growth of the amateur art market, and the practical demands of the British military. Art making was methodized and reorganized by the government schools of design and art in 19th century Britain. These schools, administered by the Department of Science and Art, regulated art practice and education that sought the implementation of a national curriculum in drawing. Though the growing influence of the Royal Academy of Art separated art making into two schools, the liberal arts, which included painting, sculpture, and architecture, and the mechanical arts that included design, engraving, and etching, drawing in ink was perceived to be the foundational skill in all of these art forms. That said, the Chinese ink stick went far beyond both schools of art and served as a fundamental medium in British art practices for both professional and amateur artists. The Robeson box further reveals that the Chinese ink stick was inseparable from the British arts curriculum. Presentation boxes like the Robeson box were given to students to recognize their outstanding achievements. Curiously, instructions for using the Chinese ink stick was excluded from the suggestions for using materials inscribed on the interior of the Robeson box's lid. According to 19th century British instruction manuals, the preparation and use of the Chinese ink stick was foundational knowledge in an art student's repertoire. Art students were expected to know how to prepare Indian ink from its solid form with an Indian inkstone or with a plain stone plate at the beginning of their training in watercolor. Interestingly, using a very similar process as one would when preparing a Chinese ink stick for calligraphy in China, according to this description from a British instruction manual. These students practiced by producing monotone drawings with varying shades of the ink with different sized brushes that were known as hair pencils. Students were expected to draw only in Indian ink until their understanding of light and shadow had been perfected. Watercolor painting was singled out to be the art form that significantly advanced British art despite the separations between professional art and amateur art, liberal arts and mechanical arts. Watercolor painters were particularly keen to compete with artists of the liberal arts, specifically with oil painters. In this context, the Robeson box and its contents represent the high value placed on watercolor painting in 19th century Britain. Watercolor painting was included in the British art curriculum, where Indian ink, the solution prepared from Chinese ink sticks, was incorporated in a number of watercolor application methods. To start a watercolor painting, students were to prepare the dead coloring or an underdrawing with Indian ink before layering on color. The colors recommended for student color box were limited because students were encouraged to mix their colors on china tiles. The muted color palette, such as that of the Roberson box, served this purpose. In order to adjust the darkness of these colors, students added an Arial gray to their color mixtures. This Arial gray was produced by rubbing down indigo and lake cakes with a very small quantity of Indian ink on a clean stone plate with water. Indian ink was also used to add the final touches to the foreground of the watercolor painting. Watercolor painting was perceived to be particularly fashionable and was valued in both the professional and amateur art worlds. In an era where art making was perceived to be in direct correlation with an individual's refinement, those who were not professional artists also took interest in watercolor painting. According to the Society of Arts premiums from 1825, prizes were offered to professionals and amateurs for drawing in chalk, pencil, or Indian ink. To accommodate the growing audience of amateur artists, Colorman invented a variety of products with a wide range of affordability, since the amateur market consisted of those from different social classes. As entrepreneurs, Colorman facilitated the commercial link between professional art and amateur art in 19th century Britain. By meeting the demands of the amateur art market through selling prepared artist materials, Colorman were the middlemen who bridged the gap between professional art and amateur art by making fine art more accessible to different communities that make up British society. Chinese ink sticks were sold separately and in sets, according to these Colorman catalogs. The decorated watercolor sets were sometimes expensive, but a small-sized Chinese ink stick alone would normally cost 1 shilling per stick. But of course, there were other more expensive options if someone could afford them. I think the best method to gauge how affordable an ink stick was at the time is to see how much of each person's salary it would take out. These costs here show that the shilling actually withheld quite a bit of buying power in the 1800s. Like, for example, 2 shillings can actually get you a 5-course meal at the Oxford Music Hall. When the shilling was compared to the salary of those listed here, the results revealed that the Chinese ink stick was actually not something that was extremely affordable, but it was not something out of reach for most people. And also remember that the Chinese ink stick is something that can last for a while. This demonstrated that drawing and art making only required owning affordable art materials, which meant that people of various social classes were offered the opportunity to make art. Artists were hired by Colorman to create instruction manuals on subjects such as history painting and landscape painting to promote their prefabricated products. Here is a Winsor & Newton manual that actually had one of the Winsor & Newton catalogs attached to the back. This manual was written by watercolor landscape artist Thomas Robertson. In these manuals, a simplified approach to watercolor painting based on copying examples categorized by difficulty was marketed to amateurs. Many of the beginner level samples were monochrome drawings in ink. It is in this context that sought the reframing of Chinese ink sticks as Indian ink, a drawing medium separate from its solid form. Though art students were still expected to know how to prepare their liquid Indian ink from Chinese ink sticks, prepared artist materials were more desirable on the amateur market. Despite receiving praise from the professional art field for maneuverability, the Chinese ink stick required time and effort to prepare. Towards the end of the 19th century, liquid Indian ink was advertised as liquid drawing ink prepared from the solid ink sticks imported from China that allowed product users to bypass the preparation of solid ink sticks, of which some artists, like Joseph Pennell, noted as tedious. One can speculate that the invention of liquid Indian ink was initially driven by the needs of artists and intensified by the desire to accommodate the amateur art market's demands for prefabricated mediums. This is a plausible explanation for the growing preference for prepared drawing ink, ultimately leading to the eventual disaffiliation of liquid Indian ink from the Chinese ink stick. The pivotal role of the Chinese ink stick in British art practice also extended to its use in the British military. With Britain's empire expanding across the world, military surveyors were assigned the vital task of recording the lay of foreign land and enemy front as swiftly and accurately as possible. Renowned watercolorist Paul Sambey was hired to be the drawing master of the first military academy, the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, founded in 1741. Plan drawing, landscape drawing, and geometrical drawing became a part of the military academy curriculum ever since, and civil drawing was eventually introduced as well. One of the subjects that were tested in the examinations for direct commissions at British military academies was drawing. This demonstrates the importance of art in the military context. Students who excelled in drawing and sketching and watercolor in secondary school were noted to have a visible advantage when entering the military academies. The very act of presenting the materials in the Roberson box as an award to a student who excelled in these subjects while in school emphasized the importance of art in defining an individual's potential and contributing to British society. The Chinese inkstick established its place as a fundamental medium in both the artistic and military environments. Despite the clear divide between the visual languages of artists and that of the military, the Chinese inkstick was indispensable in military strategy. The visual language required of drawing in the British military was rigid. Military drawing discouraged shading and desired accuracy, contours, and lines. British military drawing in the 19th century was separated into two categories by their purposes: drawing for information reconnaissance and panoramic drawings by military engineers. Drawing for information reconnaissance required rapidity, accuracy, and the ability to produce precise images while in motion. On the other hand, panoramic drawing was reconnaissance work completed from a static position at a high vantage point to record an unobstructed view of the enemy fronts or of a foreign landscape. The most desirable way to complete a sketch is with Indian ink prepared from Chinese inksticks, and watercolors after the initial sketching completed in pencil. Indian ink and pen were used whenever possible to distinguish the most accurate outlines and annotations from the initial array of pencil contours. Moreover, Indian ink was advantageous in this process because it is a waterproof medium that would not smudge when wetted. That said, a small bottle of Indian ink was essential in military personnel sets of drawing materials. The preparation of solid Chinese inksticks was a time-consuming task in the military visual language that emphasized rapidity and accuracy. Under these circumstances, a prepared bottle of liquid Indian ink would be a desirable medium to have as military personnel. British colormen were involved in providing drawing materials to military academies and distributing them abroad. The British East India Company's military school at Addiscombe, the counterpart school to the military academies at Woolwich and Sandhurst in the 19th century, trained officers to serve in the company's private army. George Rowney exported box sets of artist materials to India to serve all the branches of the British East India Company during this time. The two images on your left are some of the materials sent to the British East India Company in the 19th century by George Rowney. And this was actually pulled from their website. And on your right is an image of a Rowney color box from the National Gallery of Art's Materials collection, dating to that same time to give you an idea of what the artist materials that were available and transported might have looked like. And also to note that a Chinese inkstick was actually included in the compartment here. Here, I would also like to mention that the British East India Company did not play a huge role in bringing Chinese inksticks to Britain initially. So remember when we were talking about the private trade quotas. But the company did play a major role in its redistribution after the medium had been rebranded as Indian ink domestically in Britain. Skillful amateur artists in their own right, British soldiers serving in India not only drew in Indian ink and painted in watercolor for their military responsibilities, but they also found landscape painting as a source of their own amusement while stationed abroad. At the peak of Britain's imperial power in India, drawing and landscape painting were highly valued skill sets on military personnel to document foreign land for military strategies and to distribute the visual imagery of India through the perspective of British colonialism throughout the empire. The dominance of the British military overseas, particularly in India, likely contributed to the increased preference for liquid Indian ink over Chinese ink sticks due to the conveniences the solution provided under the military visual context in both reconnaissance work and civil drawing. Since liquid Indian ink more appropriately suited the demands of British artists, the separation between the narratives associated with the Chinese inkstick and Indian ink, respectively, was ultimately reinforced. A story that began oceans away from Britain and China with the Chinese inkstick, the contents of the National Gallery of Art's Roberson box provides a gateway into the commercial, cultural, and artistic narratives that were outcomes of Britain's global presence in the 19th century. The artifact calls our attention to the ruptured linkages between the Chinese inkstick and Indian ink. The Chinese inkstick met a wide range of British market demands. Despite the separation between professional and amateur art, the practices of visual artists and that of military artists, the Chinese inkstick was ubiquitous in British art-making practices. The Chinese inkstick, along with its liquid form, liquid Indian ink, proved to be an indispensable drawing medium that contributed to the very foundation of 19th century British art at home and abroad. The value placed on drawing and watercolor painting in British society was a result of British imperial nationalism in the 19th century. This sense of patriotism was manifested in the British education system, the growth of the amateur art market, and the military academy curriculum. The demands of these markets produced a consumer base that preferred prepared liquid Indian ink over solid ink sticks. In Britain, a number of application tools ranging from hair pencils to quill pens were used to apply prepared ink. The rich collection of instructions that describe these application methods that favored liquid ink strengthened the European concept of ink as an aqueous solution. In China, however, due to the Chinese inkstick's close relation to the art of calligraphy, the ritual of preparing Chinese inksticks is still implemented to this day. The differences in the ways in which the solid and liquid forms of ink are valued in two very distinct aesthetic traditions today further highlighted the perspectives that consider the Chinese inkstick and liquid Indian ink as two different mediums. Britain's imperial narrative of viewing their overseas territories as a monolith was ultimately inked into our historical memory through the fortification of the largely forgotten cultural ties between the Chinese inkstick and Indian ink. Communication and records written in Indian ink by scribes and clerks contributed to the materialization of the British imperial identity. Due to Indian ink's wide circulation in Britain's overseas territories, especially in colonial India, the medium was coincidentally affiliated with its supposed eponym, even though no evidence was found to indicate any relationship between India and Indian ink when the term was coined. Indian ink was used widely by soldiers who were stationed in India for reconnaissance work and for their leisure. The visual and written records produced contributed to the rich array of images that encouraged the British imagination of India. Moreover, these illustrations, whether they were accurate typographical drawings or whimsical landscapes that incorporated a soldier artist's impressions of a foreign land, exemplified the value of art making in British society that reinforced British nationalism. The Chinese inkstick was reinvented as liquid Indian ink, a perceivably brand new British product under the context of British imperialism in the 19th century. The very act of reproducing the Chinese inkstick as a British artist's material under the label Indian ink eventually disassociated the medium from its cultural origin in China. Moreover, under this premise of imperialism, liquid Indian ink's wide circulation and use throughout the British Empire as a British product expressed a sense of British ownership over the medium. the namesake of Indian ink, reinforced the othering of foreign lands that the British colonial memory motivated by conflating the Chinese inkstick, a symbol of Chinese culture, with that of India in a time when India had transformed into Britain's most prized colonial possession. That said, the National Gallery of Art's Robertson box was an artifact that contributed to the dismantling of the 19th century British imperial monolith used to define the distinct cultural identities of British territories, specifically India and China in this case. The Robertson box ultimately proved to be an important primary source that allowed us to credit all the cultural factors that contributed to the negotiations between artist materials by piecing together the intersections of Chinese and European ink traditions that were often seen as opposites in our perceptions today. Before I take questions, there are many people who I would like to thank for making this project possible. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to my supervisor, Michael Skalka, for introducing me to the fascinating world of color and artist materials manufacturing. This project would not have been possible without his endless support throughout my time at the gallery, and also his willingness to offer me his expertise, and also dedicating his time to 4-hour-long discussions with me on how and why artist materials were produced. At the gallery, I would like to thank Melanie Gifford, Michelle Ficini, and Dina Ankin for their guidance and patience when instructing me on a variety of scientific analytical tools. I would also like to thank Kim Schenk and Amy Hughes from the Paper Conservation Department for welcoming me into the lab whenever I had questions on drawing materials and papers. And also Yuri Long and the NGA library staff for always being so responsive to my research inquiries. At the National Museum of Asian Art, I would like to thank Grace Jen and Jennifer Jakai, who lent me their expertise on carbon black pigments, East Asian painting materials, and Chinese paintings conservation. Lastly, I would like to thank Elizabeth Fairman and Francis Lapka at the Yale Center for British Art, Teresa Fairbanks at the Yale University Art Gallery, Patrick Connor at the Martin Gregory Gallery in London, Sally Woodcock at the Hamilton Carr Institute, Lucy Partman at Princeton University, and Professor Ramita Ray at Syracuse University for their help at various stages of my research. And thank you again for WCG for having me, and thank you everyone for coming.
Wow, thank you so much, Tammy. That was so fascinating. So we have time for some questions now. If anyone has a question, please comment in the chat and I can call on you. Or if you want to just put a question in the chat, I can read them as well. And while that's going, Tammy, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You went so in depth on your explanations of, the history and how the sticks are used, and then this really interesting misnomer of India ink. What was something that really surprised you through your research?
I think just when I was able to connect all the dots, because if you just think of the word Indian ink without any visuals, I feel like most people would automatically think of the aqueous solution. And I was actually going through manufacturing literature for my cataloging, responsibilities. And I was like, why is this Chinese ink stick called Indian ink? And I think that was the most surprising part. And I was like, now I have to find out. And then this project happened.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions from anyone watching? I'm curious, Tammy, how long have you been working on this research? It was just so wildly thorough and impressive.
So I think around my first year at the gallery, towards the end of my first year, that's when I discovered it. But I just kind of, I was interested, so kind of did research when I had time, aside from my responsibilities. And then my boss, Michael, was the one who was like, why don't you just do a research project on this? So he was really the one that pushed me my second year. And yeah.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions. I'm going to call on someone. The name Fairbank, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
It was just amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question, and it probably has nothing to do with Chinese ink sticks, but because of the misnomers of the 20th century Indian ink, I was always told there was shellac in it, and also you sometimes see it applied, and it very often is shiny and it cracks and flakes. We see a lot of that in conservation. Do you have any thoughts on that particular ink? We've never analyzed it, but it doesn't sound like a Chinese ink.
No. Because I guess that would be one of the my future, whatever, if I want to pursue this project any further, that would be one of the questions that I would hopefully be able to answer. But yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I guess we'll have to be able to also analyze the Indian ink from the 19th century because on the catalogs it actually said this is the liquid form of the Chinese ink stick imported from China, and see if there's shellac in there. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. Basically, they apply the term India to all sorts of things, like the India papers, which in some cases are from other countries as well.
Right.
So, well, congratulations, and thank you for sharing your wonderful research.
Yeah, thank you.
And Tammy, a question came in the chat from David Lake Prince. He asks, did artists use other vehicles to liquefy the stick? I could see the benefits from using oil versus water.
That actually didn't come up. I think I mainly focused on the student instruction manuals just to get to a foundational what was required. It would be really I'm sure other artists manipulated in different ways, but that would be something for further research.
Great, thanks. I had a question about the different animal glues. Was there any regional linkage in China to which animal source, or is it based on the ink studio?
Actually, that's a great question. I was never able to find out. So they only listed the most common sources of animal glue, and they actually have varying reviews for all of them. So there are some sources that say fish glue is the best, but there are also some that says it's the worst. So it's just the reviews are kind of all over the place. So that would also be another area for further research.
Nice to know that reviews hold true, today still, with some people loving things and some really hating them. I have another question. Did you get a feeling for when ink sticks fell out of fashion?
I think, for my research, it feels like it was probably around the late 19th century when they introduced the liquid ink. Because I think when I was doing my research, there were other versions of liquid ink. Because I think there is the Western, the European history or historical canon also have their own tradition of Indian ink. Not Indian ink, just ink in general. And mine was really about finding the intersections. They also tried to make a bunch of other types of ink, but it wasn't waterproof and it didn't work very well. And I think that's in the 1890s, that's when Winsor and Newton was like, all right, we're just gonna make this liquid and sell it because no one wants to prepare it. And it works well, so.
I love that. So I have a question. What are the next steps with this project?
Oh, so many next steps. I feel like I can go micro and I can also go further out as well. So I actually prepared some samples that were sitting in the gallery waiting for me to do PLM on them. So that would be my immediate next step, just to see, hopefully be able to see some of the sizes of the particles and also how they relate to the other components in the box. And also binder material is very interesting to me because I think you can immediately tell by the polysaccharides whether they're animal or vegetable, but then to animal or plant. but to do further analysis on whether, like what kind of animal binder is something that I'm really interested in. And I don't think anyone has done that quite yet. So that would be like the micro aspect. And further out, like just also trace like the redistribution of it as Indian ink. And I think in a way, like the British imperial narrative was successful because now we hold up an ink pen and we don't think about like this entire like, you know, complex history about where it came from and how it was redistributed. And just tracing that would also be really interesting.
What other material projects are you working on at the National Gallery?
This is my main project right now and I'm like wrapping up. And now I'm just like continuing to work on the database. We just got a new collection of vintage materials that is going to go further into the 19th century and fill some of the gaps in our 20th century. So it won't just be a modern materials collection, it'll actually be very comprehensive. And yeah, I just can't wait to put that online and hopefully we can make that public for everyone to access and get people interested in materials because I think it's super cool.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we have one more question, Tammy, and then we'll let you go. Given so much of your research was grounded in British, Indian, and Chinese history, were there hurdles to your international research?
Definitely. So I wasn't able to travel even pre-COVID. It was just like, this is just the way it worked out. So, but I was like really glad that everyone I reached out to was super accommodating, who is in London and everyone who's at Yale. They were able to send me images really quickly. And also like going back to the question about next steps would be traveling and going to actually see these objects. I feel like that would really inform my research.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy. This was really a phenomenal talk. And I think everyone's out there, you know, clapping silently for you. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.